Welcome, everybody, on behalf of the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies at London Metropolitan University. My name is Matthew Barrack. I'm the director of the centre, and I'm going to hand over in a minute to Hosn Hussami, who is going to chair today's event. I wanted to say that this event is being recorded. It will be edited and shared later. If you do not wish to appear on the recording, please turn off your camera. And obviously don't ask any questions. Anybody else who would like to be involved in the conversation, you are very, very welcome to ask questions either using the Q&A box or by putting your hand up at the end of the event when Hosn will chair the question and answer period. So I just wanted to also say that everybody is very welcome to our public-facing events, many of which are online. Please go to the CUBE website, Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies at London Met. I'm not going to tell you what the website is because it's a very, very long string of letters, but please do search for it and find it and come and join us at any of our future events. We're absolutely delighted to host Audazi and Frederick Wiesenborn today. And over to you, Hosn, to chair today's session. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. As mentioned by Matthew, I am Hosn Hussami, a current PhD research student and Vice Chancellor Scholar here at London Met. Welcome everyone to today's CUBE seminar, which will be presented by Audazi and Dr. Frederick Wiesenborn from the Athar Collective on the topic of post-disaster spatial practices. This talk will draw from research developed over the last year in Beirut, Lebanon, and explores insights from how the city has responded to the tragic port explosion in August 2020. The presentation will discuss Athar's research into different types of practice developed after the blast. This research has also benefited from the support of the RIBA. Athar is the Arabic word for trace, and the Athar Collective explores the relationship between the changes in the built environment and the changes in the body politic, looking specifically at the built environment in Lebanon and the wider Arabic world. The collective was set up by our lovely two speakers, Aud, who is an architect, tutor, researcher, and has been working for Stephen Trevelyan Architects since 2019. Among other things, she is a member of the Arab Center for Architecture in Beirut, and Fred, who is a researcher who explores the relationship between the built form and urban social justice. Aud and Fred have taught in various built environment and design facilities in the UK and the USA, including the AA, the Bartlett, BCU, CSM, our very own London Met, LSA, Glasgow School of Architecture, and the GSAPP. The research project featured in this seminar holds great interest to myself as my own work is also situated in Beirut, also looking at forms of participatory practices and their application to city development. I'm very pleased to then now promptly move on to our speakers. Welcome, Aud and Fred.
Thank you. I can just start by sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, perfect. So thank you, Hosn, for this introduction, and thank you everyone who has logged in today for our seminar. Fred and I are super pleased to be here with you today to discuss some of the insights from our RIBA research funded project. There's quite a lot to go through. There's quite a lot to cover, and we'll say more about how we've approached our research and the insights we developed in a moment. We'll also be looking forward to hearing from the audience later on any questions you might have. But before we do so, it is important to say a few words about the blast, its impact, and the context and what has happened since. Some of you might have seen the photos and video of the blast, but for those of you who haven't, we wanted to give you a trigger warning, as some of the content we'll show in today's presentation might be distressing. With that being said, let us start by taking you back to the moment of the explosion. On August 4th, 2020, at 18:06 local time, a massive explosion occurred in the port of Beirut. The epicenter of the blast was warehouse number 12, which is adjacent to the grain silo that you can see on the screen here. For reasons that are still being uncovered, warehouse 12 was holding a large amount of ammonium nitrate, which is an explosive material very dangerous. So initial reports suggest that close to 2,700 tons of it were stored there, but it has since been adjusted down. Nevertheless, we're talking about a huge amount of explosive kept in extremely close proximity to the center of the city's capital, next to buzzing neighborhoods where people were going out about their daily business, next to people's homes, etc. Recent findings actually made by journalists suggest that the explosives were being kept in that warehouse for later deployment in the civil war in Syria, which Hezbollah has been involved in, and that the events that led to the explosion were likely set in motion by workers welding a hole into the warehouse shut. However, much of this is still unclear as the official investigation of the blast is being dragged out. Whatever the cause, the blast had a massive and devastating impact on local communities as well as the built environment. It resulted in the death of 218 people, 7,000 injured, as well as leaving an estimated of 300,000 people displaced. Meanwhile, the damage to the built environment is estimated to be in the region of $15 billion. These figures are absolutely staggering, which should give pause for thought. This slide over here would help you understand the scale of the impact compared to other cities like New York and London. What was striking about an event like this is the fact that it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, when everyone was isolating at home and being cautious. People had this sense of safety being home, and that was shattered by the explosion. In a sense, the blast blurred the division between public and private, with the outside and inside morphing into one. We believe this is quite a powerful picture because it's getting quite hard to read what is outside and what is inside. The spatial practices that occurred in the aftermath redefine how we think about public and shared space, the relationship between balconies, homes, and streets. You can see here this old resident of the neighborhood very adjacent to the blast, refusing to leave her home, even though the situation of the house was really bad. So 3.5 years actually after the blast, official investigation into the event has been dragged down and blocked by local authorities and specifically by Hezbollah, leaving many Lebanese people irate about the state of their country and the political class that governs it. As such, the blast has contributed to further delegitimize an already suspect political class, not least because the state didn't respond to the blast for quite some time. That meant that stream cleanups and reconstruction of buildings was largely left to local communities who sprang into action in the days and weeks after the disaster, self-organizing to bring some order back into the built environment, whether that was through reconstruction of window frames, walls, as for instance, the organization like Bebe Shebek, who did a lot of cleaning of debris in the street.
The blast was somehow like this. Thousands of people felt I have to do something. I was not personally hit, but I have to do something. So you saw thousands of young people, mostly in the streets, trying to help in whatever they can, from Beirut and from outside Beirut. Cleaning the streets, taking the rubble away, helping elderly or other people with no means, just do basic survival actions. And of course, the story is known. You have a lot of NGOs who came in, international institutions. Of course, the lack of a serious intervention on the part of the authorities. I mean, the recent history of Lebanon is known. So it allowed people to feel that they could do something, no matter what this is, whether as experts or as just young people or other people. You saw also, I cannot say it was only young people, actually. I saw many people who were simply there to try to help. They would propose their help. What do you need? Do you need a car to go bring whatever? I will go and do it. Do you need furniture? I will give you my furniture. I will give this, give you that. That was great. You also had people who were trying to do some business because of the explosion. People who wanted, for example, to propose to buy your building, demolished building. People who would use this opportunity to kick the dwellers out and gentrify the area, the building, build a tower, what have you. These also exist. We have all sorts of things that happen after a blast like this. And I think it will take us years to realize and understand what all of this means.
We saw here George Arbid of the Arab Center for Architecture, who we've produced a short film with over the in the summer of 2023. Among other things, he discusses the blast. We don't have time to play the whole film today, but I think this short clip gives you a sense of the immediate actions taken by the communities.
Okay, I'll sort of do the next couple of minutes of speaking. Before I do that, I just wanted to say that we will be playing another clip with Georges a bit later, but you can also watch the whole film that we produced on our YouTube channel, which we'll link to in the chats after the presentation. Now, as Aude mentioned, the blast happened in 2020, but we only went on our research trip to Beirut in August 2023 to coincide with the 3-year anniversary of the disaster. And inevitably that raises important questions about what it means to develop place-specific research sometime after the event in question has taken place. What do you, so to speak, gain in terms of novel perspectives with that temporal distance, and what do you lose? What do you become blind to? In many ways, these questions came to underpin and in some ways define our research, and I'll say more about that in a second. However, it's also instructive to mention not the timing of the project, but the place in which it was developed. So for the duration of our research, Aude and I were based at the Arab Center for Architecture in the Ashrafiyya neighborhood of Beirut. This is a photo of the office that we were based in. You can see that we're in the process of shooting a part of the film that we developed together with Georges, and that's where we were based for the for most of the time when we were doing our research. Now, for those of you that don't know it, the Arab Center for Architecture, or the ACA, is a prestigious research center which, among other things, administrates a large archive of mainly modern Arabic architecture. The drawing you can see on your screen now is of the Électricité du Liban building, which is an iconic modernist building that sits on the waterfront right in front of the port. Now, just like the timing of our trip, the fact that we were working essentially in an archive came to inform our research in a profound way. It helped focus our gaze on issues to do with remembrance and forgetting, with documentation and fidelity, even with accountability. And it led us to consider what these terms mean in a built environment context. In more concrete terms, that included thinking about the role the built environment plays in collective memory processes, and the role that it plays as an active force in the wider cultural and political imaginary. Two issues that are particularly apt in a city with as long and as rich, for better or for worse, a history as Beirut's. In terms of our methodology, we decided to take a predominantly qualitative approach to our research, speaking to local people involved in the response to the blast, academics, artists, architects, heritage experts, and so on, as well as community groups. And we did so to map the practices that these stakeholders had developed in the aftermath of the blast, but also to capture their reflections on those practices after the event. As you've seen, we've also developed a film with local filmmakers and recorded sound recordings and interviews as audio files. This is us out shooting with a local academic, Charbel Maskiné, and our filmmaker, Fadi Yeni Turk, that we were working with throughout the trip. And if I mention this, it's because I think both of these mediums, audio and film, taught us important things about the subject matter that we were investigating, specifically by letting us hear and see things we wouldn't otherwise have experienced, aspects of the blast and the response which we wouldn't have been exposed to in quite the same way, and which therefore we wouldn't have understood in the same way if we had taken, let's say, an alternative approach. And I think it's important to be honest about this and even to emphasize it, particularly to the students on today's call, that your research takes you down different pathways which help inform in outline the insights you are trying to develop. And I suppose it's important to be conscious of that, but also, if you can, to acknowledge it and to embrace it. So when we first embarked on our research, we were looking to develop insights into three main categories of spatial practices, and you can see them here on the screen, going left to right: crisis and immediate relief. So the spatial practices developed in the immediate aftermath of the blast. A second phase relates to longer-term care, and then a third phase which relates to political mobilization and the development of new ways of framing essentially the body politic. During our initial consultations, which we developed in the months leading up to our trip to Beirut, it became clear that a lot of research had already been developed into the immediate response, and we didn't want to duplicate that. So we decided to focus mainly on the final two, so longer-term care and political mobilization. Now, looking back, I also think the two factors I mentioned earlier, our temporal distance from the event and the fact that we were based in an archive while we developed the research, I think that also played a role in our focus on those, let's say, those two categories of spatial practices. So we'll be focusing on those two today, but if you have any questions about the immediate relief, we'll be very happy to take questions on that in the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay, so if we take a look at some of the practices related to longer-term care, when we visited Beirut, we noticed that some of the places that have been involved in the distribution of aid in the days and weeks after the blast had in time pivoted to a new model where they provided what we call long-term care for the community. Nation Station is a great example of this pivot. Their work started out with a focus on the immediate relief, working out of an abandoned gas station that you can see over here. Over time, it morphed into something else, a place for communities to come together, socialize, as well as a place to come together and heal. They now have a cultural program at the station, which includes yoga and art classes, therapy sessions, and social get-togethers. They also have a medical clinic along with workshops for most vulnerable, like, for example, this workshop on the danger of self-medication, especially with the economic crisis and people not being able to afford to go see a doctor. They also have a fantastic farmers market to support and empower local farmers. That's twice a week, and they help them become more sustainable as well. They've even supported Syria in the after the earthquake that hit the country and the country of Turkey in 2023. And so they have started to explore how they might replicate the model they've developed in Beirut somewhere else. So that's the first tactic for longer-term care, creating a focal point for cultural programming to enable communities to come together and process the trauma and heal. The second tactic for longer-term care relates more directly to the built environment, specifically to reestablishing and preserving the character of neighborhoods in need of reconstruction after the blast. This includes heritage buildings like the one you see over here from the 30s and 50s, but also more mundane buildings that form around 90% of the city and where everyone lives. Concretely, organizations like the Arab Center for Architecture worked on a framework and a catalog that you can see here to ensure reconstruction is mindful of the built heritage of the neighborhoods. From the urban grain down to the materiality of the buildings, they've developed a pattern book as a guide to reconstruction. This included a number of helpful resources, including an overview of material used in local buildings, advice on which finishes to use in each development, for example, window frames, lintels, jambs, as well as an index of local tradespeople and a dictionary for the built environment terms in Arabic. At the larger scale of the city, the blast is also being used respectively as an opportunity to rationalize the urban grid in the area around the port, enabling the regeneration and integration of the port to the city, which, as you can see here, that's the port in this area. And that's the rest of the city where you have a lot of shops, restaurants, and people living, and you have that motorway that cuts and creates a division between the two. Again, this is about thinking about the long-term history of Beirut and the history of the port itself, which originated in 1500 BC. And since the Ottoman area was the main port in the Middle East and the link between Europe and the Middle East. So thinking about how we can reconnect the port to the old city. So you can see here the harbor here, and then how it was very well connected to the old town.
Okay, thanks, Aude. So another category of spatial practice, which has its own set of tactics that we were exploring during our research, relates to the way that buildings and other structures have become incorporated as anchor points in processes of political mobilization in Beirut and in Lebanon more widely. This set of practices taps into the recent history in Beirut, which, in addition to the blast, includes various protest movements, the most recent of which took place in 2019 and 2020, political assassinations, terrorist attacks, and wars with regional powers. There's also the occupation of Lebanon by the Syrian army, which ended in 2005. And of course, the civil war, which began in 1975, ebbing and flowing throughout the 1980s until it came to an end in 1990. Now, if we mention these historical moments, each of which could easily be rolled out into their own full lecture or even lecture series, it's because they form part of the political and cultural imaginary in Lebanon. The blast is just the most recent addition to this ferment, always bubbling away, and it arguably interacts with those historical processes that I mentioned just now, many of which have never really been resolved, in ways that are unpredictable, politically charged, and more often than not, profoundly spatial. A first tactic in the category of political mobilization relates to what we call the politics of commemoration, particularly as this is enacted through community-led, place-based action. As the name of this tactic suggests, the spatial practices in question are dedicated to the preservation of a memory, in this case, the shared memory of the families whose loved ones lost their lives in the blast, or who were severely injured by it. And there are, in fact, quite a few examples of this form of spatialized memorialization in response to the blast, including people putting up photos of loved ones in public places, such as, for instance, on the motorway barriers next to the port, or on walls in neighborhoods affected by the blast, like downtown and Karantina. I believe this photo is from downtown. One particularly instructive example of this tactic relates to the so-called Silent Witness campaign. And this is a campaign that, organized by people affected by the blast, seeks to preserve the grain silos in the port, which are adjacent to Warehouse 12, and which absorbed a large part of the blast when it occurred. Thereby offering protection to Beirutis through their sheer bulk and mass that the political class had failed to afford them. Now, importantly and rather tellingly, the government has declared that what remains of these silos must be demolished. They've done so under the pretext that the silos constitute a danger to public safety, something which is disputed by the families, as well as various structural engineers and heritage preservation experts. So the campaign, in effect, is to preserve the silos, and in doing so, to maintain the blame and the shame that the families attribute to the government and which they embed into the silos as leftover structures. So from a spatial perspective, what we see in this campaign is the investment in, or the pouring into, the built environment of the anguish, anxiety, and anger of the communities in question, against a state which they hold responsible for the blast and which they want to hold accountable in a legal and political sense as well. This narrative about the alleged culpability of the state is in telling opposition to the official state narrative, which one now finds embodied in various commissioned sculptures that riff on the theme of the phoenix, which, as we know, rises resiliently from its own ashes. But as a clip that will roll in a moment of Georges Abid shows, many Beirutis don't want to be resilient. In fact, they want a clean break with a political class that they perceive to be corrupt, decadent, and fundamentally delegitimized. So resilience is not an option, rather things must be allowed to break. And the Silent Witness campaign is about exactly that. It's about bearing witness to a debacle which has lasted for over 30 years and which the families wish to bring to an end through the painful but poignant spatial politics of commemoration and through the emotional and also political investment of their frustration and hopes into the silos. So here's Georges Abid talking about this phenomenon in more detail.
And the other side, which is over amnesia, I also wrote about this, the amnesic phoenix, I call it. We have this idea that the phoenix will rise no matter what and so on. We are very strong. And there is a word I hate, which is resilience, right? You're resilient. It means that you will redo the same mistakes because you survive anything. I mean, we would have been better without resilience because we would have reacted. We were so resilient gradually across time that we accepted anything and like an explosion, and now it's business and life as usual. Resilience is not good. The phoenix is not good. There are a lot of myths we have to get away with and start really working seriously on breaking these myths and trying to do something that is collectively good. That's my opinion on these things. Certainly, this antagonistics or this opposition between amnesia or tabula rasa is it's recurrent in our history. What I call for is a rationalization of facts on which you could build your decisions in order to move on to a better living. It should neither be completely amnesic nor completely romantic about keeping everything as is and so on. I mean, life happens. Learn from what life tells you. Learn from precedents here and anywhere else, and move on. And sometimes it takes tragedies to force you to move on. Fortunately, our tragedies keep us where we are. They are this idea of the phoenix. The phoenix rises, but it rises for the same people. Vultures. They can perpetuate their power with the tragedies of others. They have the means, they have the control, they have the power, they have the slogan, they have the media. And you protest a little bit, fine. And now you have to survive. And they are always ahead of you in whatever you do. They can recycle. They keep themselves in power. So the lesson for me in all of this is to on one hand, of course, if when it comes to politics, is to organize protest better so that it's more efficient. But I think there is work that has to be done on the individual himself and herself. You know, they have to protest against their own biases on how they do it and why they do it and how efficient it can become and so on. Some people think that by putting a like on some statement on Facebook or Insta, they made their revolution. It's not a revolution.
Okay, so I think that's one thing to maybe come back to in the Q&A, which I'm very fascinated by, which is how do you balance between remembrance, and also what Georges calls the tabula rasa, so like drawing a line under things and trying to look ahead. And I think for those on the call today that have you know, a background in Lebanon, their families might be from there, they might be from there themselves, it would be great to hear what you think is the appropriate balance between remembering things that maybe are uncomfortable to remember, but also not being captive to that memory, allowing yourself to look ahead. I think it's a really interesting question. For now, I'll move on with the presentation, and I'll speak about a second spatial tactic, which also relates in a way to processes of commemoration, but which explore alternative, more abstract or non-figurative ways to charge the political imagination. So rather than investing existing structures with meaning, which is what we saw in the Silent Witness campaign, this tactic seeks to profile or outline a cataclysmic event using new structures informed by what we call non-figurative forms of expression. So one example of this non-figurative approach is found in the work of Marwan Reshmawi. Marwan is an established Lebanese artist who has been working with the built environment as a motif since the 1990s, including building to scale models of iconic Beirut buildings like the Burj Al Mur that you can see here, and also mapping the whole of the street network out as an installation, which is what you saw in the previous slide. Now, when the blast happened, Marwan was preparing works for a new show. These artworks were stored at his Karantina gallery, which, located about a kilometer from the blast site, was devastated by the explosion. You can see, maybe if you zoom in a bit, you can see the extent of the damage to the gallery on the slide that we've got up now. Now, after the blasts, Marwan went to the gallery and recuperated around 600 kilos of predominantly metal from the destroyed building. And he compressed this material into 34 monolithic elements, of which you can see some examples now on the screen. And the work was, he told us when we interviewed him, quote, a memorial to crushed lives, to crushed futures, but also to memories, end quote. Now, in their pared back stele-like form, these elements offer an almost complete rejection of the formal expression that we see in the state-commissioned Phoenix sculptures. So rather than representing an idealized mythology, which is arguably what those Phoenix sculptures do, these sculptures reject figuration, they reject representation, referring instead to the arduous process of reconstruction. As Marwan told us, the work, quote, was not about the explosion. It was about putting things in order again, end quote. So it was almost like a therapeutic exercise that he had to go through to make sense of the world. And as such, this work celebrates the reconstructive work of individuals, of communities, but it also rejects narratives that can be put to a political end. And I think in the very politically charged environment of contemporary Lebanon, there's a lesson in there. Another example of this non-figurative approach to spatializing trauma and memory is found in the work of Ayatui, an Emirati Lebanese sound artist who's based in Beirut. Now, previously, Aya has been part of a group that developed an operatic performance in the squatted environment of an important cultural building in downtown Beirut. It's the Grand Théâtre. You can see it here on the screen. Some of you will know it. And that work was conceived during the 2019 protests that rocked Lebanon and used the built environment essentially to tell stories about new beginnings through the at least partially figurative form of opera. And concretely what they did was they used the final aria from the Wagner opera Tristan and Isolde, which is called Liebestod, the love of death, to tell a story about endings, but also about new beginnings. However, for her work on the blast, Aya, you can see a quote here on the screen, has chosen to reject figuration and instead work exclusively with sound. That work was still under development when we met her in Beirut last summer, but she told us that the emerging artwork that she's producing is informed by a logic that, again, rejects representation. More concretely, Aya told us that, in her eyes, the key to understanding the blast, which most Beirutis, let's not forget, first experienced as sound, whether through the sound of the explosion or the crunch, crunch, crunch of walking on broken glass in the days and weeks after the event, that the key to understanding the blast lies in the mobilization and investigation of sound. Put differently, that the best way to unlock the trauma of the blast is by retracing in outline the audio profile of the blast, following the trail back to the original event, to thereby hold it up into the light and examine the traumatic profile of the disaster. Now, what's striking about both Marwan and Aya's approaches to their artworks is the complete rejection of figuration. This almost feels like an accusation of representation, that it's somehow complicit with hegemonic discourses, that it somehow enables totalizing narratives. As such, these artworks outline what we might call lines of flight that stray beyond oppressive symbolic structures into a plane that sits adjacent to what psychoanalysts like Lacan might call the real. That is, into territories beyond the horizon of established discourse. Territories dedicated to the constructive and emancipatory reevaluation of an event, in this case, the blast. So along with the immediate need to provide relief and the longer term support structures erected in the community, these more political forms of spatial practice speak to the efforts of a community that is, in a way, attempting to heal itself in the aftermath of a disaster, to grieve, to hold to account, but also, and this is important, to imagine alternative futures.
So what comes next? We end this presentation by saying the following, that the current state of the Lebanese politic is very much informed by the event that led to the blast. No accountability and pure negligence. More than 1 year after the end of former president's term, Lebanon remains without a president in the middle of multiple crises. Lebanon is divided parliamentaries fail to elect a successor, putting their personal ambitions ahead of the interests of the country. As the years go by, we're witnessing an attempt to change Lebanon's identity, democracy, and freedom. We'd like to end by hoping that one day we'll be able to break this cycle and bring justice to the people who lost their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aude and Fred, for such an enticing presentation into your research. It's invigorating to hear about research in a city that has been so close to my own heart, specifically your work in different forms of media we don't usually see in traditional forms of architectural practice and research, such as film and audio. I will first link the YouTube clip in the Q&A, as I think most people will be able to access that, which will take everyone to the film discussed in the presentation. Before I extend the floor to ask the audience questions, I have a few of my own. In my own research, I was partially based in Karantina also. I found that there were several barriers to accessing certain communities. These range from political boundaries to individuals' hesitance, and as well as issues such as research fatigue, which a lot of people experienced post the disaster, with a lot of organizations on the ground so soon after the blast. I was lucky that I had a very well-established facilitator in the area, but I was wondering whether you came across such hurdles and how did you navigate this?
Yeah, actually, we thought about that when we were working with Nation Station. So since they have a strong base and strong community, at first we initially intended on doing workshops and events with the local community, but then thought that it might be easier to take a step back and get all that information from the founders and the people who are working there, rather than, I wouldn't say taking advantage, but then having or forcing people to talk again about their traumas, especially 3 years after. Maybe for some people the time have passed and they can talk about it, whereas for others they're still very much in that state of mind. So we were very cautious, and whenever we did research, we made sure to talk to mostly academics, researchers on the ground that have a bit more distance from the event itself, and not the people actually who lost members of their families or are heavily impacted by the blast now. I think that's, yeah.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I think it's absolutely right to point out that we were very clear when we went to Beirut, where Aude is from. I'm not. So for those of you wondering, I'm from Denmark. I've been sort of going to Lebanon for the last 5 years and have, it has a very important place in my heart as a place and as a polity. But we were very clear that we didn't want to go to Lebanon with an exploitative sort of agenda. We wanted this to be an opportunity to speak to communities, but we didn't want to force them to inadvertently force them to relive their trauma. So that was very important to us. In terms of how we managed that, we spent quite a lot of time in the months and weeks leading up to our trip, reaching out through various networks, which I think is a really useful activity for others looking to do research, to establish not just who we could talk to, but also to evaluate our initial assumptions. And so actually our kind of framing of the research changed quite a lot in the 6 months leading up to the trip, which was important because the risk was, if we hadn't done that, if we hadn't done the outreach, we would have ended up inadvertently duplicating research that had already taken place. There's a lot of really amazing research institutions and academics working out of Beirut and Lebanon that had already done important work. Beirut Urban Lab is one of them, but there are others, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't duplicate any of that. So that was one point. In terms of like navigating the political kind of invisible boundaries that you mentioned as well, I think that's a really interesting question. And obviously, there's lots of artworks that kind of deal with this, with the very deep histories, very charged histories of places and neighborhoods in Beirut. And we were informed by that. I would say as well that this was maybe the time that I was the most aware of political insignia, political portraits, also plaques in the built environment of various international NGOs that were funding the reconstruction. I became very aware of how in many ways mediated the urban experience in Beirut is. You're really bombarded with meaning all the time. So it's a very complicated sort of web of meaning to navigate, and this sort of semiotics of that is quite complicated, but also quite fascinating.
Yes, I think in kind of comparison to other urban cities where you usually find kind of advertisement for kind of loads of commercial products, Beirut is quite unique in the fact that the advertisement is very kind of political, where you have political figures and their political allegiances plastered all over certain neighborhoods, kind of telling you where each neighborhood stands. We were actually discussing this earlier before the seminar, but Beirut is such a unique environment, both, as you mentioned, due to its history and present social composition, to the degree that it's often dubbed the city of contradictions. May I ask a kind of two-part question? Firstly, how has a location such as Beirut prepared you for working in other areas in the wider Arabic location and further out in the world? But in addition to this, are there any parts of your practices that cannot be applicable elsewhere and that are very unique and exclusive to the city?
Do you want to have a word? Or?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, initially when we thought about it, it's more thinking that for the immediate relief, for example, it's something that would happen in any catastrophic events, even if it's not war-related or bombings. It can be an earthquake, flooding. You'll have the same type of response of people, hopefully, of people coming together and trying to help one another. So that's where we think these spatial practices can be replicated. So for instance, what happened in Syria and Turkey with the earthquake was not due to bombing, but due to a natural disaster where you don't have any, you can't control it, right? And it also maybe you won't have any accountability later because no planet Earth is accountable. But whereas this one is much more complex because it seems like an accident or not, but it's even more frustrating, I think, to investigate and to try to heal after an event like that. I don't know, Fred, if you want to say a bit more on that.
Sure. I think that's a really interesting question, like how transferable are spatial practices from one setting to another. And I think you're absolutely right in homing in on the very unique specificity of Beirut as a place, as a polity, as an area that's been continuously inhabited for 6,000 years, I think, and has been through, you know, multiple empires, French mandates, civil wars, occupations, and so on. So it's incredibly charged as a city with political meaning, cultural meaning, and so on. I think what we sort of set out to do, and I don't know whether we really, you know, succeeded, but we were sort of trying to see what, if you strip back the specificity, are there certain practices that you could almost build a kind of manual around, like things that you could do in another spatial setting if something similar should happen. And I think maybe the presentation we did today was sort of focused on certain of those themes, but we've maybe unpacked that in more detail in our report that we hope to be able to share on our website soon. But I think the point is that, and that's kind of where the categories came from, there inevitably will need to be some immediate relief, which is about aid distribution, about coordination, sometimes, and that was the case in Lebanon, and probably also in areas of Turkey and Syria. A lot of that will have to come from the community. So it's how do you organize that? Something we didn't have time to go into today was the use of social media to kind of channel the energies and sort of to help organize the response. But then also ensuring that part of that is not just about aid distribution, but it's also about reestablishing the built environment, because that's where a lot of dignity comes from in terms of people's sense of of managing a crisis. So we discussed that in more detail in the report. And then obviously the other two categories, the longer term care, where many of the places that had been involved in the immediate response kind of pivot into a different mode. They sort of flow from that in a way. And then the political imagination. I mean, these are sort of, we sort of separate them out as different strands, but in fact, there's a lot of overlap between these. And I think inevitably that's how it will be. But obviously with what's going on in the Middle East right now, we know there will have to be a large rebuilding of Gaza. And so the question is pertinent.
I think
also how much can you translate? I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, if we can add to that, like Fred, I think you mentioned an organized response. I think it's not only the 24 or 48 hours, but also when the event itself happened, because we all know that there was initially a fire that lasted for 45 minutes, and that's where the Lebanese state or authorities failed. They could have evacuated part of the city in these 45 minutes, knowing that there's explosive or dangerous material stored in the port, whereas instead they've just sent the firefighters there, who ended up all of them losing their lives. And so from the moment of the fire, there was no response. And even after that, there was no response. So it's just complete void, which is, yeah.
I think if I can just jump onto that, I think there's something very interesting in Beirut and in Lebanon more broadly, which is the tension between the void and the supercharged, right? And in a way, that's kind of what Georges is sort of pawing at in one of the clips that we played. You know, the distinction and the contradiction between a complete kind of remembrance of everything, and also the complete suppression of that, right? So that feels like quite a powerful dynamic that takes place in the political and cultural imaginary in Lebanon. Like either, you know, you have artworks like the Atlas Group that kind of represent the civil war, but they create a pseudo archive with some of the artworks actually not really representing things that have actually happened. So there's this kind of strange boundary that comes out of that tension between the injunction to remember everything and at the same time to forget everything and suppress that. I don't know if I articulated that very well, but I think that's something that you find a lot, and you see it also in the built environment. You know, the regeneration of downtown slash centre-ville after the civil war, where you've completely razed everything to the ground, all the evidence of the war, and created kind of a consumerist paradise for very wealthy people. There again, you have this kind of conflict between memory, which can be traumatic, and then a complete absence of memory, which is sort of glossed over by hyper-consumerism, which is a very strange place to be in.
I guess this is where that point of resilience that was discussed in your presentation comes up, which was atypically expressed as a kind of negative response that almost keeps the population locked in a status quo of we want to remember these past elements of our city while also ignoring all the issues that led up to the destruction of these elements. I think Matthew has a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for this presentation, and it's great to pull this together. We've been talking about it for a while. I think it's interesting that you called your project and your presentation spatial practices. You know, this phrase carries a lot of, it has its own story, certainly in architecture schools. And the idea of spatial practices also is very much associated with certain directions in art practice and the interface between art practice and activism of various kinds. Also, it's been adopted in other areas of cultural study at the interface also with human geography, studies in literature, where the idea of spatializing what writing can do is part of that story. So I don't want to ask a very academic question, but just to sort of say, is there anything that you wanted to say about why you chose to call this study spatial practices? That's one side of the question. And then the other side of the question that is particularly distinctive to us and certainly relevant, distinctive to me, and certainly relevant to us here as a School of Art, Architecture and Design, is that you are an interdisciplinary pair, but you come at this as this sort of international, very cosmopolitan pair of researchers doing work in a particular kind of situation, and you are an architect in practice and a geographer. And certainly for architectural research, there's often this assumption of understanding places and spaces from the point of your expertise, but often taking for granted that that can give you a particular way of seeing and doing things. So these are two questions. You can either ask one of them, answer one of them, or both of them. But that's really what I'm interested in, the kind of interdisciplinary of what you're doing, both from the point of view of this sometimes trendy phrase, spatial practices, but also from the real interdisciplinary perspective that you come at it from.
Okay.
Sorry, just before you answer, just to let people in the audience know, you may raise your hand to ask a question either with your microphone, or there's a Q&A bar to type in your question.
Shall I have a stab at that dual
Yeah.
question? So I think just to kind of make sure that I got it right, so there was an initial question about spatial practice, why spatial practice, and then a second one which was about our sort of disciplinary backgrounds and how that's contributed to a certain framing, I suppose, of how we've approached this, and you can see how those two kind of work together. So in terms of the spatial practices, I think there's sort of multiple reasons for that. I think we were very early on clear that we were going to be speaking to people that had been involved in the response, that came from many different backgrounds, that weren't necessarily sitting within in disciplinary terms, very clear kind of set of categories like architects and urbanists. And so we wanted to sort of celebrate that and accommodate that. I think another reason, as you say, it's quite a trendy term, and it enabled us maybe also to get funding, where if we had been using a less trendy term, we might not have gotten the funding. I think that's just how it is. But I think, you know, the point is how much of it is part of the essence of the project and how much of it is a facade. And I think it does speak to the range of practices that we were in contact with in the lead up to and during our research trip. So, you know, everything from heritage experts to architects, artists. There's quite a big focus towards the end of the presentation on how artists, either in isolation or as part of community groups, try and use spatial practices or like to put something out into the world that responds to an event which has since been prolonged in some kind of feeling of trauma, right? So how does, which is what you do as an artist, you put something into the world and it kind of tells a story, or it enables you to tell new stories, right? So we were quite fascinated by that.
Yeah, and I think it also relates a lot to the behavior of people and how you would react to an event like that, spatially in the streets of Beirut and regarding different types of communities as well. So, of course, Beirut is a particular city, but also the way the urban environment is set and urban planning is very particular in Beirut. It's a bit chaotic. There's no real sense of organization, so everyone goes and plays by their own rule, which is, for us, categorizing these spatial practices was really interesting, because how do you make sense of the chaos that exists now and the void that exists now in Beirut and in Lebanon? And I think that happens in a lot of countries where you don't have a clear leadership from the state or from local authorities or municipalities. So it's yeah, that's also another point of view that we've talked about, Fred and I.
And then in answer to the second question about the kind of disciplinary sort of framing of things. So you're right, Aude has a background in architecture and is in practice. My background is not as an architect. I didn't train as an architect, but more of a kind of political scientist, geographer. I now work for a charity that actually works quite a lot with the built environment, but kind of bring a different expertise. So there's always going to be some give and take between Aude and I when we sort of start wrapping our heads around a particular project. And I think that's kind of part of the development of the project. I think what we experienced with this particular project that was quite interesting and which we could only really gesture at in the presentation is we had some funding from the RIBA, and we were able to do some things with that funding, and we weren't able to do other things. So we were able to develop one film which drew a lot on Georges Arbid, the president and founder of the Arab Center for Architecture. And we sort of took lots of B-roll that we went out with our filmmaker to shoot in Beirut. And actually doing that was the first time that both of us worked with film as a medium, was a learning curve for us. So we had like the first day, we just absolutely smashed it out of the park. It was a perfect shoot, and we thought we could walk on water. And then the next day was just, for various reasons, less successful. So there was a real learning curve, but also driving around with our filmmaker in his old beaten up VW Beetle, stopping at different sites in and around Beirut that had not just a meaning to the project, but also a meaning to him, was something that certainly for me enabled me to see things in a different way, right? So that's what I was sort of trying to suggest, that maybe my go-to as someone who has largely an academic background is to kind of read as much as I can about a certain thing and to try and form sort of some understanding of whatever it is I'm studying in that way, but actually being out with a camera, with a microphone, with a cameraman, enabled us to see the city in a different way. And I think it actually informed our research in quite profound ways.
Thanks. I'm just going to come back with one tiny follow-up comment. I mean, I think you also used the phrase, I might be getting this wrong, but I think there was something about place-based research that you said. And I think that this idiom of really using the place, the being there-ness as a generator for a point of view that has that ethical claim on the ground as it is. I was just thinking about one of the more recent events that we did as part of this series, AAD Sessions, was with a chap who's who's actually an alumnus of our course, Paulo Moreira, who's a very gifted researcher currently at Wits in Johannesburg. And he produced a book called Critical Neighborhoods, where also this claim, the ethical claim of the being there quality of these neighborhoods, which are often in crisis or in conflict in some way, create a kind of relationship with it that allows you to get an understanding of the criticality of that environment. And I see echoes of this ethical dimension in your research, which I think is very appealing.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we were based in the archive center allowed us also to unfold a lot of history of the buildings, because so Fred, for example, hadn't been in Beirut obviously since the blast. So walking around together in the streets, you would think that the event just happened, because still so much of Beirut hasn't been reconstructed. It's all scaffolding in construction with the branding US aid or French aid or the UN. So it's a bit weird to go there 3 years after and see that there's so much that hasn't been restored yet. And so being in the archive center as well helped us understand the history and the layers of how these buildings were built and how important they are. And the good thing about the Arab Center for Architecture is that they not only focus on heritage buildings that are technically from the 30s or 20s, they also focus on buildings from the 30s, from the 60s and the 80s that some some of us might think that don't have enough value, but actually that's where most of the Beirutis' lives and activities happen. They don't happen in these selected, graded, listed buildings. They happen in the everyday, mundane buildings, which was also quite interesting.
I was quite interested in what you were saying about the being there of place. So being there, if I remember correctly, is a term that you have from phenomenology, and about a certain kind of situatedness in the world that flows from the human body. And I think there was definitely kind of an element of that in the research. And then the other thing, yeah, coming back to what Aude was saying, being part of, or spending part of our time there in the Arab Center for Architecture, being surrounded by the paraphernalia that you would find in an archive, models, drawings, pictures. It's sort of brought to life the lives both before and after the blast, the lives before and after the civil war, the kind of the longue durée, if you will, of Beirut as a place. And yeah, I can't quite pinpoint exactly how, but I'm almost certain that it will have informed our research in quite important ways.
Thank you.
At the risk of continuing a private conversation here, I just want to mention that this discussion that we are rehearsing a little bit chimes very directly with the current agenda of the Arts and Humanities Research Council around place-based research. And so obviously you can treat this, what you've been doing, as a pilot project, but it seems to me that if you were looking to formulate something more substantial going forwards, you're in a good position to use what you've done as the basis for, you know, a small an effort to upscale it. Obviously, you would need partnerships and so forth to do that. But I think that this agenda of place experimentation in the context of sites like this, disaster sites, post-conflict sites, and so forth. I mean, it's quite difficult to make those kind of projects stick, but you have a very interesting conceptual framework already. And I think by drawing on, these related projects, for example, the ones I already mentioned, it could be a very appealing proposition. So yeah, great stuff.
That's very helpful.
I would like to open this up a bit to the audience just to see if they have any questions. You will be able to access your mics if anyone wants to raise their hand in the bar up top, if anyone has any questions, or if you are a bit shy speaking into your mic, there's also the Q&A bar. Christian?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was in Beirut last summer,
Oh.
and I found it. I was interested. You said it was a so chaotic structure of a city, and I didn't find it that. As a first-time person there, it seemed to me like many cities that have different layers, that have different agendas, and obviously the very complicated political situation with Druze and Maronites and Shias and Sunnis, and that finds its way into government, and therefore I imagine over various periods develops very locally in the areas around their own particular support. But I was reminded in what you were saying about whether it had a coherence of a comment by Walter Benjamin in his I think it's his autobiography of a childhood, a Berlin childhood, I think it's called, where he says the only thing in a great what makes a great city is not being able to orientate yourself, but to get lost. The ability to get lost is, in a sense, one of the great moments. And he talks about how stepping back from a main boulevard, suddenly you find yourself very quickly into an extraordinary different environment. And I have to say that's my lasting memory of Beirut, is crossing a road, turning down a street and finding myself almost immediately in an extraordinary different place. You know, a market in one street would be very different from a market 6 meters away down another street. And so I wonder whether, I mean, it's not really a question, it's an observation, really, but whether actually it is not less coherent than other places, that actually it has a similar coherence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, it does make sense, and I'm glad that you enjoyed Beirut and felt that way. I think for me particularly, having grown up there and then moving to London, you feel that, of course, I mean, it's a city very rich in terms of layers, and you have different characters in different neighborhoods, but you do have the sense of not feeling safe in the streets. So the basic things that would embody a built environment or a city are not present. That's where I use the word chaotic. But of course, if it was the city itself, of course, it's an amazing place, super rich in history, culture, traces of different people who came and left. But there is this sense of organized chaos, especially in planning. So, for example, there was a project that we looked at very close to the port where they wanted to create a public plaza in front of the building. In the presentation that we showed there's a building that looks a bit like the Flatiron. So there's been a project to create a really small public plaza accessible to everyone. And this has been blocked for the past couple of months by political class who think that creating a public plaza would lead to foreigners coming and creating a hostile environment. And so who can take advantage of that space? So these kinds of reactions from the government or local authorities of creating just a small park and putting a bench are non-existent in Lebanon, which is very unfortunate. And the way also heritage buildings have been demolished after the blast. I mean, I think if an event like that would happen in London, for instance, I think there would be more campaign to preserve these buildings. Whereas in Beirut, you're busy dealing with life and surviving, that you don't have time to worry about these things, and it just passes and flows by in front of you.
I think that's true, but I also think, you know, maybe London is not a fair comparison. I mean, if you compare it to, say, Belgrade, after the bombing there, the communications building was left for many years, 5 or 6 years, 7, maybe even longer, as a pile of rubble. And, you know, I think perhaps the more comparable city is Alexandria, which is also has planning issues like you were discussing. You know, there's the ability to enforce planning regulations is a very different one. But I would actually say, from my experience in both, albeit a very small time in both, I was walking around with my wife around Beirut, and it was chaotic, but I wouldn't have said it was unsafe. Even when we found ourselves in places that suddenly you thought maybe we shouldn't be here.
We weren't supposed to be here.
it still felt we were close enough that we could come out. You know, it was. I think it's just more the unfamiliarity of the spaces and the difference, the amazing contrast of those differences. So I don't know. The issue, I suppose, is in terms of what you're talking about is how do you begin then to rebuild those when in fact so many of them were almost random or not defined spaces, but actually spaces that had grown. How can you build something which is random back again when the argument is to build something more ordered in those areas, but at the same time questioning then the communities that would have lived there in the first place? So these aren't really questions, it's just a chat, really, but interesting.
Thank you for your comment.
I was wondering, and I would just reiterate that if there's anyone on the call that want to ask any questions, particularly if you're in Lebanon, it'd be really interesting to hear. Also, comments. It might not be a question, it might be a comment or a reflection. But whilst we wait for that, I was just wondering, Hossein, you know, you're taking for your own research. Does kind of some of the insights that we've sort of discussed today, do they resonate with your own research? Can you tell us a bit about your research and whether there is any correspondence between what we've discussed and what you're exploring?
Well, so I'm looking at emergent mapping methodologies specific to Sabra and Karantina, which is the location discussed in your presentation, with a specific focus on children and children's participation in architectural practices and their hopes for their own cities, so their imaginings for their cities. I guess the thing that I found that struck me the most in common was this idea of, yeah, we don't want this notion of resilience anymore. We've done it too many times and repeated it too many times, even within the children that haven't seen, you'd expect much of the different issues that have passed, but even just seeing the riots that came about a few years ago and then the blast following that, they want to see something new and not predefined by these kind of pre-established status quos of these social hierarchies in terms of both kind of economics and the religious kind of sectarian divides of the city. And now more than ever, the kind of influx of refugees from different populations around the Middle East, these children don't want to see these divides emerge further and break the city apart into more fractured zones. But yeah, I think that's where I've seen a lot of overlap in your presentation.
It's interesting because, I mean, we were there in August 2023, and in many ways our research offers a snapshot from that time, but obviously the situation keeps evolving, and since then we've had the conflict break out in Gaza, and obviously there is a large population of refugees coming over from Syria as well. So these things keep kind of working within the body politic of Lebanon more widely, and Beirut in particular. And obviously there's the backdrop with the economic crisis you've got. There's the political legitimacy crisis that Aude talked about. There's no president. There's no elected governor of the Bank of Lebanon. People are having their assets frozen. So it's a very charged, even for a country like Lebanon, it's an exceptionally charged moment. And it almost feels so. The last time I was in Beirut before August was in October 2019, actually, which was quite an interesting time to be there because that was when the protests broke out. But in many ways, it felt like two completely different places in terms of people's emotions. So when I was there in October 2019, there was a sense of like, let's change everything, let's change things, and we can do this. And it felt slightly more deflated, I have to say, when I was there in August. And I can only imagine what it must feel like now with all of the geopolitical tensions and conflicts that are now playing out, not just in Israel and Palestine, actually also into Lebanon, right? So there's kind of regular confrontations on the border. So it's an exceptionally tricky moment.
Yes, I think in terms of what's going on currently compared to a few years ago, so even 3 or 4 years ago, I think in terms of the collective, it seems to be just history repeating itself in more volatile ways, in kind of shorter spans of time, and the population's getting quite fatigued from everything going on, that they feel, what is the point? Again, this whole idea that you mentioned of resilience, what is the point of this anymore when we keep being resilient and not seeing any change come through from it? In order to just wrap this up, because I know I have spotted some people leaving the talk, a very kind of cliche question, but what's next for your research?
Well, that's really interesting. I think we've only just wrapped up the report that we've produced for the RIBA, so we've spent a lot of time on that. We are looking at whether we can bring to life some of our insights through exhibitions. So there's a number of institutions in the UK and outside of the UK, also in Lebanon, that we're in talks to at the moment. We're very, I think, particularly interested in this notion of, which is also the name of the film that you can go and see on YouTube, by the way, of the archivist as an activist. So what does it mean to mobilize memories in order to understand the past and also to build a bridge to the future? And how do you translate that into practices that relate to the built environment? So that's what I would say is next. I noticed that there's a hand that's gone up, but Ud, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Not at the moment. I think we'll just take the question from, is it Nicola?
Yes, sorry, I've come in rather late to the presentation, so I do apologise. But I've just got really, like Christian, I've got a kind of observation. Many years ago, I went to Lebanon long before all the current crises that we're facing. Indeed, before Syria, the Syrian crisis as well. So it's quite a long time ago, in the late 90s. But I've got an interesting. I'm reading a book which I've been kind of absorbing and recognizing its currency, not in positive ways, but maybe in a very kind of disturbing sense. Peter Slotchevic's book called Rage and Time, very well-known German philosopher. He's written a number of seminal texts. It was published in English, I think, 2012, which is also quite an interesting date. But he kind of argues that we need to think about rage as part of a kind of that needs to be channeled in positive ways. And he compares the ancient world, how rage was understood. He puts rage in a symmetrical relationship to issues of pride. And I'm interested in how we think of this issue of rage in the context of architecture. If we think of architecture when it's destroyed for whatever reason, for reckless reasons, as well as for, let's say, political, ideological reasons, as we've seen, almost on a repeated basis in places like Beirut, then to what extent can architecture, as in its restorative process, in its aspect of as a demonstration of renewal, kind of address or serve as a channel for this question of rage? And it seems to me interesting because I would say the word conflict is not the appropriate word that we should be using here. We're using what Slotchevic calls the hardening of rage, because it happens too often. Yeah. We think of conflict as having a timeline. It has a point of maximum impact, but ultimately at some point it declines, and then we're able to get back to our lives or find some kind of recourse to reconciliation. And I think what we're confronting here on both sides of the Lebanon, thinking about Syria, which the conflict hasn't finished, it hasn't somehow been reconciled. And then, of course, we have the conflict in Gaza, but also the internal conflicts within Lebanon, which, of course, you've articulated, both economic, political, social. So there's a kind of wave of rage that's going on at all dimensions, at all levels. And here we have architecture presenting itself in its destroyed, ruined state, its emaciated state as well, trying to restore itself, trying to get back to a sense of a semblance of normality, if you like, of what urban life really is. And it seems to me that Beirut is a kind of microcosm at an extreme level, perhaps, of maybe things that are happening or going to happen in other parts of the world. It seems to me a really interesting, completely disturbing and very, very troubling, but nevertheless a really interesting point to reflect on, the relation between architecture and Slotchevic's theories or principles of rage, both in the historic sense, in the contemporary world.
I think that's very interesting. It's a bit of a mic drop to throw in at 6:57. If I may, just a couple of reflections on that. So I think one on the topic of rage and how it can become spatialized. When just before I left Beirut this summer, there were a couple of attacks from I would call right-wing young men that were attacking people that they perceived to be homosexuals in the Jemaisi and Madim Khail neighborhoods of Beirut. And for me, that was quite a worrying occurrence because Beirut, for better or for worse, has historically been considered a place of fairly liberal values, also when it comes to the sexual lives of citizens. And I did wonder at the time, is this what, is this the sort of the lesson from Weimar Germany is if you put people under sufficient pressure, and if you have hyperinflation, and if you have political uncertainty, and if you have a largely young population that grow up in chaos and they just want to see change, maybe what comes out at the other side is a kind of fascism. And I was quite concerned about that. Now, if you look at architecture and rage, you know, you can look at that in a number of places. You can look at what's going on in America right now. I would argue that a lot of the Make America Great movement again is founded on a sense of rage. And that actually also translates into the built environment. I don't know if you remember, one of the things that President Trump did when he was president the first time around was to kind of to champion this kind of neoclassical style, which was perceived, I imagine, to be pure and to express strength. I guess that's some of the qualities that he saw in that. And in a slightly more played down version, I'm going to say something that's controversial now. There is also, obviously, in the UK, the push to build better and build beautiful, which has its own government-driven sort of narrative. And there are think tanks that are associated with the Department for Levelling Up that have certain political affiliations. So I think the kind of the coupling of rage, how that spills over into the political lives of peoples, and how that then translates into the built environment is very interesting. And I agree that what's happening in Beirut right now is probably one of the more interesting manifestations of that.
And I think it's important to know that that's part of the strategy of the people in power, to distract you with other problems. So, for example, in August, while we were attending Fred and I the third year commemoration, the following week, Barbie, the movie, was banned, and everyone was talking about it for weeks. So, like, you get distracted in these things and events and for example, now we don't have a president, government, so, and it's for you to stop thinking about what happened before and be distracted with a new topic each week, more catastrophic than the other. And this issue of rage, and everyone's thinking, okay, why hasn't been there more mass protests? Like after the blast, there's been a couple of protests, but not the same in 2019. And I think that happens everywhere around the world where there's a really bad economic crisis. People don't have the strength anymore to go, and don't have the means as well to pay for gas and go and protest. So the more vulnerable or the more important the crisis is, the less you protest. And it got dangerous as well to protest at the end. So it's all very well played, I think. It's not, yeah, it's anyway.
It's now 7, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But thank you so much again, Ord and Frederick, for
thank you for
your
having
wonderful
us.
talk, and your answers to the questions were up. Just again, a reminder to the audience, the link to the YouTube channel is in the Q&A tab. Please check that out, and there will be a recording of this up on the LMU website at some point. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.